Hello everyone, I'm Catherine Rustomji. I'm a charities partner at Brown Jacobson. My session today is trying to give you some top tips for charity trustees. So if we were looking at what this session will cover, then ideally it wouldn't be any one or more of these graphics that you can see here. So definitely looking for good behaviours rather than some of the common behaviours that can creep in. So in terms of trustee meetings, I think one of the key points is that trustees give sufficient time to the role that they have taken on. So there is no magic number. It isn't, 1 hour a month is enough, half an hour isn't. It depends on what's sufficient in terms of the role that you have taken and the complexity of your charity. In terms of trustee meetings, definitely open the papers, whether that's physical or by email. Those papers should be read in advance and considered so that those turning up to meetings are ready to discuss them rather than spending time reading them as a group. There's also the issue of being informed so that trustees are doing their own research where relevant, not just relying on the information that is presented to them. They're also making their own inquiries and being interested generally in the topic. There's also the issue of timeliness. I have a client of mine who mentioned to me, what's the one way of making a meeting start on time? Start the meeting on time, but so much of this we ignore the people who have turned up on time and we wait for those that are late. Personally, I think we should start the meetings on time, and then others will soon get the idea that actually if you're late, the meeting will start without you. And I think finally, just be ready. I think sometimes meetings can be very disruptive at the start. People are perhaps getting themselves settled, getting up and down from the table, maybe less so now that we're doing virtual meetings more. But I think just generally coming ready to discuss the agenda and being focused on the items at hand. In terms of your charity's governing document, I think it's really good as trustees if you are familiar with it, if you've perhaps marked it up with sticky labels so that you can locate the various sections in it that you might need. I think the most important provisions are probably these on the screen here. So the name of your charity for a start, that you are actually referring to the correct name of your charity. The objects clause in particular, this is about what your charity is set up to do. So we definitely need to refer to the precise wording of the objects and not simply how people have remembered it or abbreviated it. There will then follow a list of powers. Those powers are exercisable if what you're doing is in furtherance of the objects. So step 1, you need to see, is what's being proposed further in the objects? Step 2, do we have a specific power or powers to enable us to do this? Or maybe there's a general power that allows you to do anything that's lawful as long as that's furthering the objects. Next, the trustee sections. So how many are you required to have? Is there a minimum and a maximum number? How are trustees appointed? And also how can they be removed from time to time? That might be needed. So you want to be familiar with the provisions relating to trustees. And then often the most referred to section would relate to meetings generally. So how many are you required to have in a year? What is the quorum for a trustees meeting? You need to know what that quorum is, because if you're below it, your meeting isn't valid and nothing you do at that meeting will be valid. But also if you've got conflicts of interest or if trustees need to leave a meeting early, then you might dip below the quorum at that point. And again, that will invalidate the meeting. So you need to keep an eye on the quorum and make sure that you are always above it. And then finally, voting. Are there any specific rules in your governing document requiring a certain percentage in order for a decision to be carried? And in the absence of that, it will always be a simple majority of the trustees voting in favour that will carry a decision. So meetings generally, as I mentioned at the start, I think come prepared. So you have the documents that you need in front of you, you have reviewed them in advance, you've come ready to have a discussion. But I think in general, just be there. I think we can all see when people are tuning out of a meeting, maybe they're not really engaging, not really listening to the discussion. So it's all about focus and making sure that, meetings are as short as they reasonably can be. Actually, if you can have a focused discussion, then that could reduce the length of time of the meeting. things. But I also think there is an issue about 2 ears, 1 mouth, so that trustees are there to listen to each other and to listen to others rather than dominating all of the discussion and all of the airtime, perhaps. And then finally, sometimes you just want to encourage people to say something because they haven't said anything at all during the meeting. And to me, that would be a cause for concern, to think, is everybody as involved in this discussion and debate and meeting as everybody else? I think if there's something that they say could be either useful, interesting and/or relevant, then even better. So we're not just saying say something for the sake of it, but I think it's looking at the contribution generally of all trustees and making sure that that is fairly shared in terms of enabling people to be as involved as they are comfortable with. Next, I think be a team player. So a trustee board is all about group decision making. And I think sometimes that's where issues can come in because we've all got different personality types, different styles, different ways of communicating. And I think sometimes if a bit more consideration was given to the tone of people's voices and the style of their communication, then that might be a way of avoiding these sorts of fallings out that can happen on boards. So sometimes it's definitely unintentional, but it doesn't make it any less upsetting for the person on the receiving end of it. So I think there is a bit of a piece there about how trustees communicate with each other and what's acceptable and what isn't. I think sometimes it's about being patient. So we all have different areas of strengths and weaknesses. Some trustees might get it more quickly than others. Some, I suppose, come to a conclusion by talking things through. Others might come to that by thinking it through and not actually verbalizing anything. So I think we need to be patient with each other to give that space and time for trustees to work through the issues in their own way. I think a positive would be to try and draw out the skills and talents of trustees. So whether that's your own or your colleagues. So it's understanding where your areas of expertise lie, so that if a colleague with specific knowledge of marketing hasn't spoken up on that issue yet, you could perhaps bring them into the conversation and open that up for them so that they have the opportunity to put their views across. So I think it is about trying to be the best trustee board that you can be, and that includes sharing the limelight and bringing out the different skills and expertise that you have on the board so that you're making the best decisions that you can. Your decisions are as informed as possible. And then the final point here, be prepared to act as a critical friend. This is a tricky balancing point, I think. It is or should be about improvement for the benefit of the charity rather than point scoring. So being a critical friend, I think, is looking at yourself as much as others, but also generally saying, how can we improve? How can we be better? How could we do this more efficiently and effectively? So I think it is all about, you're never the finished article. There's always things that you could be doing better, and approaching things with that appetite to try and improve wherever possible. Disagreements will happen. I think in general, again, it's about tone and style so that people understand how their message is coming across. Are they being confrontational? Are they being objectionable generally? But I think it's about, again, that there will be areas and times where trustees don't agree with each other, but you need to find a way of being able to do that while still being a functioning board. So sometimes that's about learning how to handle disagreements, agreeing in advance almost how you will disagree, that views will still be put across politely, they won't be personal criticisms or too invasive perhaps in terms of what you're saying and how you're saying it. I think when you are sharing views, wherever possible, look to accentuate the positives, so that where there is a disagreement, you're looking for perhaps some common ground where you do agree on things, but then identifying some areas where perhaps there is disagreement and looking to find resolution of those issues. I think sometimes, though, not all disagreements can be resolved. So at times, I think it is simply a case of let's agree to disagree. We don't need to keep going over the same points over and over again. I think sometimes you just need to move on. And I think in general, when giving feedback or appraisals on others and perhaps how they're discharging their role, whether that's fellow trustees, whether that's the person chairing the meeting, then sometimes I think this expression could be helpful, where you go for the ball and not the player. So again, you're not making any criticism personal to the individual, you are making it relating to the role that they are carrying out and where perhaps you think improvements could be made. So possible areas of improvement would relate to induction generally, perhaps. I think sometimes the induction process isn't as tailored as it could be. Maybe it's more general, it's just giving copies of documents and then saying, there you go, and the first meeting is in 3 weeks' time and we'll see you then. I think maybe looking at how you can get a new trustee on board and make them as effective as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think sometimes that could be done by allocating them a buddy on the trustee board. So one of the other trustees who's their particular point person that they can go to with any queries and be introduced to people and the systems, so that you're trying to make new trustees feel as welcome as possible from the start. I think a role description can be useful that sets out the expectations of trustees, whether that's a time commitment, whether that is how many meetings they're expected to attend, when are those meetings held, other expectations, I suppose, in terms of behaviours sometimes, what is acceptable, what wouldn't be, trying to tackle any problems before they arise so that it was clear from the start what the expectations are of this particular role. Ongoing training is very useful. So the fact that you're at this conference, you're seeking to improve, you want to continue to learn and develop in your role. And I think that is all required as a charity trustee. One area could be to question effectiveness. I think it's very useful at every meeting, so whether that's at board meetings, whether it's subcommittees, to have a final item on the agenda that says meeting effectiveness. And so in real time, you can evaluate, well, how useful, how effective was today's meeting? What went well? What didn't? What could we have improved? What items were on the agenda that maybe shouldn't be going forward? Or did we think that we managed the time well? Are we operating well as a board? All of those questions, you're looking for immediate improvements. And then you've got the next meeting to then say, right, well, we know what areas we want to improve upon. Let's put that into practice. And then finally, in relation to meetings, possible areas of improvement could be around the agenda generally. How focused is it? What makes it onto the agenda? You might want to think about dividing the agenda up so that you have some items at the start that are for decision. Then you have a section that's for discussion, and then you have the final section that's for information, so that you're trying to prioritise the time that you're spending together as a group, so that the for information section is for you to read in advance and only raise any questions about if you needed to. The for discussion section is exactly that. You can have a discussion, but there's no immediate decision needed, but it focuses your attention on the decision-making section to say, this is the format and the subject matter of today's meeting, and these are the decisions we need to take. I think the length of meetings can be relevant, and that might come up if you start questioning the effectiveness of whether there is a dip in concentration because meetings are too long. You know, are you trying to cover too much in one go? And that might also link to the time of day. Are people too tired? Are you having your meetings in the evening? They've already had a full day. Have people managed to eat a meal before the meeting? Are they dipping because their blood sugar is dipping, perhaps? So time of day could be relevant, and day of the week could be relevant. And I think sometimes you need to ask those open questions about, you know, could we do this better if we change the way that our meetings are organised? And then just to finish with, sometimes I'm asked, you know, what are the standards that trustees are measured against? And there are two general standards. The first one here is the standard of skill of trustees, which is the degree of competence which could reasonably be expected from someone with your degree of knowledge and experience. So the standard of skill will vary from one trustee to the next, but you are expected to bring your knowledge and experience and share that with your fellow trustee members, so that you're then making a group decision that's based on this shared knowledge and experience that each of the trustees bring to then make that collective decision together. So standard of skill is one part, and the other part is the standard of care of trustees, which is the degree of care a reasonable person would exercise on his own behalf. So here, if you are perhaps being overly critical of yourselves as trustees and aiming for perfection, you might want to just reflect on that and think, would a reasonable person do this if they were making this decision themselves rather than wearing a charity trustee hat? And so there, that might enable you perhaps to be a bit more accepting of risk that you're not able to avoid or minimize, and realize that yes, it is something that a reasonable person would do, and therefore it is something that potentially we as trustees could do as well. But I hope some of those tips were useful for you, and I hope you enjoy your conference. Thank you very much for listening.